Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director, for taking time to be able to be here. Wanted to follow up a little bit on my colleague, Mr. Holgren's question in regards to the Senate regulation bill, and you'd indicated that you'd like to maybe be able to point to some of the legislation that we passed out of the House, how we might be able to improve that to make sure that we're getting sensible regulations in place. And would you like to address that?
I'm a big fan of regular order, and the way that I think it's supposed to work, or at least it used to work when I watched it on television as a kid, was that the Senate would pass a version of a bill, the House would pass a version of a bill, and they try and work out the differences to see if they could compromise. I think that is the best formula for arriving at the best result. I happen to like just about everything in the Senate bill. I also recognize the fact that it doesn't contain several dozen, if not more, bills that have passed out of this chamber on a bipartisan basis and the larger House chamber on a bipartisan basis, which does make me wonder, why can't we add that to the Senate bill? There's some really good things that y'all, and I was here when we did some of it, worked together to try and improve Dodd-Frank. And I think it makes complete sense to continue the debate on whether or not that bipartisan support can translate into bipartisan support across on the other side of the hill. So I applaud what the Senate has done. I know it's not easy to pass a piece of bipartisan legislation anywhere, let alone in the Senate. And I think they've done an excellent job. I don't think that necessarily needs to be the end of the analysis. And to the extent that y'all have done really good work to find ways on a bipartisan basis to improve Dodd-Frank, God bless you, and let's see if we can't add that to the Senate bill. If not, Senate bill is a great fallback. But if it can get better, why wouldn't we accept that as a really good outcome?
And I appreciate that. So if we had a bill that came out of this committee with unanimous support on the House floor, you don't see that as a poison pill?
I know how hard it is to get unanimous support in this chamber and on the House floor, so that means that the bill might actually have a chance of passing in the Senate. So I welcome any efforts to reform as much of the Dodd-Frank, especially the parts that pertain to the Bureau, as you possibly can.
Right. Well, and when you're talking about Dodd-Frank, I think one thing we've certainly heard from home, particularly from our small community bankers, our small credit unions, is the one-size-fits-all approach out of Dodd-Frank. And you embrace, I assume, the ability to be able to tailor those regulations to be able to meet the size of the institution, the applicability of issues they face?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to a group of community bankers just this week, accepting for sake of the discussion that the Bureau was created in order to prevent the next financial crisis. We can have a really interesting conversation about whether or not it could do that, whether that's the proper role, but let's assume that for sake of this discussion. I don't think anybody in this chamber would suggest that the community banks or the credit unions were the cause of the financial crisis and they should be treated the same as the large financial institutions, which in many circumstances is what we do, what Dodd-Frank does and what the Bureau does. And I'm going to try really hard to try and fix that, to tailor regulations to the size and the sophistication of the various entities that we oversee, because I just think that makes sense.
Well, and I want to applaud that. I think that that's a little change in direction from the previous director, just to be able to apply the actual law. You know, I think, could you give maybe a little more detailed when you're talking about some of the quantitative analysis that you are looking at when you're making some of your decisions? Maybe expand on that a bit for us.
Yeah, it's just, I just want more data. I've read through a couple of the cost-benefit analyses on a couple of the previous rules that we put out, and I was just not, it would not have met my test. And that's sort of how I look at things, is that the lawsuit we dismissed, okay? The only one, by the way. The filter that I ultimately came down to, there's a lot of factors that went into it, but the ultimate filter was, would I have brought that lawsuit if I were the director at the time it came time to file? And that was the only one I said no to, and that's why we dismissed it. And I have to bring the same analysis to the sort of the cost-benefit analysis that I see, which is, I've looked at this stuff and say, if I had been the director when this came across my desk, would this have satisfied me to be sufficient to make a final decision? The answer would have been no. And I want to do better with that moving forward to where we get better and more cost-benefit analysis before we make final determinations.
Great. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I will yield to you for any further questions you may have.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. With respect, among other things,